I've played and enjoyed a variety of Zelda games over the years. From something as grandiose as Breath of the Wild to something as relatively simple as Minish Cap, I've done a lot of Zelda games on this channel and even reviewed them. However, I haven't really gotten around to reviewing the Zelda game that brought the franchise into 3D for the first time. That's right, you better whip out your Ocarina and prepare to lose 7 years of your life as I review The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time. That is to say, the 3DS remake and the Master Quest version of that. It's still roughly the same. For those of you who have been living under a rock somewhere, The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time is widely considered, if not the best game of all time, then pretty close to it. It basically revolutionized the idea of 3D action-adventure games, and many games made today are essentially built right off its shoulders. While I personally prefer Majora's Mask, it wouldn't have been possible without Ocarina of Time in the strictest sense possible. The game is split into 2 periods of time, one where you're Child Link and one where you're Adult Link. You start out as Child Link, of course. When the game first starts, you lack items of any kind, and the first order of business is to retrieve a sword and shield. The game won't let you continue until you do. The Kokiri sword is easy enough to get, you just need to actually find it and maneuver around an Indiana Jones-style boulder. It sort of shows a few things like crawling, navigating obstacles, and opening chests. The Deku shield isn't nearly as straightforward to get, it requires you to have 40 rupees. The way I usually got it was skipping along the stone plates in the small creek, since that gives you a little rupees when you do. Whatever way you choose to get the required amount of rupees, you're finally allowed into the first dungeon of the game. The game's method of controlling sword and shield is an interesting one to be sure. You have to press B to get both of them, and R causes Link to pull out his shield. Normally you can't move and have your shield up at the same time, but L targeting allows you to move with it up. The targeting system in particular is sort of one thing Ocarina of Time inspired in the action-adventure genre. It's the reason when I played Dark Souls 3, its similar targeting system kind of reminded me of Zelda. As you'd expect, it causes you to orbit around your target, and you can do side hops or backflips to try to avoid attacks. Considering this is from the N64 era, it's aged pretty well. It isn't the most refined in the world, especially in terms of picking out a specific target if there are multiples, but it more than gets the job done most of the time. Perhaps one unfortunate thing of the 3DS version specifically is that it doesn't have Majora's Mask 3D's upgrade of not being able to freely turn the camera with a second stick. I know the 3DS didn't technically have 2 sticks, although newer models and an add-on did, but it's still a shame. Oh well, at least unlike Majora's Mask 3D, Ocarina of Time 3D is completely faithful to the original in terms of gameplay, but we'll get back to that. Getting into the Great Deku Tree is the first of what will be many of the game's staple locations, known as dungeons. There's 9 altogether, counting 3 as Child Link, 5 as Adult Link, then Ganon's Castle. Well, I say 5 for Adult Link, but there's actually one where it's halfway Kid Link and halfway Adult Link, so it's more like 3.5 and 4.5. In any case, a few things will be the staple in all of them. They follow a pretty standard formula that's become the standard for many Zelda games. Typically, there's a dungeon map, a compass, a dungeon item, and a boss key. The dungeon map is pretty self-explanatory. It gives you an overview of the entirety of the dungeon's layout. It's not super detailed, but it's enough to get a good grasp of where you can go. The compass not only shows where you are in each room, but also lays out where treasure chests and the boss are. Both aren't necessarily mandatory, but they serve to make your life a lot easier for getting through the various dungeons. There also tends to be mini-bosses, although how many tends to vary. In the base game, there tends to be one guarding the dungeon item, but the Master Quest flips everything around. Either way, though, you'll be fighting through mini-bosses at some point. The dungeon item is typically something like a slingshot or a bomb bag that you need to progress with. More often than not, the item has combat or otherwise worldly uses outside of just the dungeon, which is good since it sort of gives a Metroidvania feel to it. Your first dungeon item, the slingshot, isn't the most powerful weapon in the world, but having a ranged option is certainly nice. The second is the bomb bag. Prior you had bomb flowers, but having a portable option certainly helps with versatility. Obviously it's for cracking tougher surfaces and enemies with. Demolition for the win, baby! The third is the boomerang, giving you a ranged option that has unlimited uses. It's also nice to have for stunning enemies and certain obstacles with. The first of the Adult Link dungeon items is the bow and arrow, the more mature version of the slingshot, possessing more piercing power. The second is the Megaton hammer, useful for damaging tougher enemies in some circumstances, but it's not the most used outside of rusty switches. The third is the long shot, providing a lot of extra range to the hook shot for more distant targets. Next is the hover boots, providing you a few seconds of floating over air before you fall. Obviously, it's really useful for closing some gaps, but you'll want to take them off when you're not using them because it makes your movements very slippery. You're also more vulnerable to being pushed around by fans. The final main dungeon actually has 2 dungeon items, one for Kid Link and one for Adult Link, although Adult Link makes use of both of them. The silver gauntlets allow you to move and lift much heavier things, being adult-sized, so Kid Link can't use them. The other in the same dungeon is the Mirror Shield. This polished hunk of chrome reflects light. Now all we need is a sword like Kars' brilliant bone blade, and we'll have quite a light show indeed. All joking aside, Ganon's castle technically has one item itself in the form of the golden gauntlets. The boss key is self-explanatory. It's in a fancy gold chest and you use to open the boss door with. You don't have to turn it right like in Skyward Sword or outmaneuver a grabby hand like in Spirit Tracks, it's literally just a big key. Naturally, you can also get non-big keys, or small keys as Zelda likes to call them, to open regular locked doors. Both only usable in the current dungeon, of course. This isn't NES Zelda. The funny thing about mini-bosses and bosses in the Master Quest is that apart from taking double damage in the 3DS version, they're the same as the base game. This sort of makes them a breath of fresh air after going through significantly tougher regular dungeons. As for non-dungeon items, the most basic is the Deku Nuts and Sticks. Nuts can stun enemies, but I don't really use them all that often. Sticks can technically be used as a strong but fragile weapon, but it's mainly used for transporting fire around. Or at least before you get an item specifically to make fire on the spot. The Hylian Shield is basically a metal shield, heavily recommended for Death Mount because fire tends to burn through wood. Humorously though, Link turtles up when he uses it. I guess it's a bit too heavy for him, but Adult Link handles it normally. The Goron Bracelet is basically just the Kid Link version of the gauntlets, permitting you to pick up bomb flowers. The Silver Scale and its optional variant, the Golden Scale, allow you to dive much deeper into the water. Then you've got the 3 special goddess items, each one correlating to one of the main 3. They take up various amounts of magic to use. Dense Fire, as it says on the tin, casts a great ball of fire around you. It sure is great for lighting up torches or enemy flesh. Ferrari's Wind creates a transport point in a dungeon for you to return to later, basically the role Uko would make in Twilight Princess. And a paywall that would serve in Skyward Sword HD, but moving on, Narrow's Love consumes the most magic in exchange for creating a temporary barrier around you that absorbs damage. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the Ocarina, since after all it's in the title of the game. You first acquire what's called the Fairy Ocarina as you're leaving the Kokiri Forest. You can learn various songs ranging from Zelda's Lullaby that serves as a key to something like the Sun Song that has a demonstrable impact. You even get handy-dandy fast travel songs at some point. Right before the Master Sword, you also get the Ocarina of Time. Roll credits, ding! Aside from being a more elegant blue color and coming with a Song of Time, it's pretty much the same. It's more for plot reasons than a gameplay boost, really. One thing that helps is learning Epona's song in Romani Ranch before you go Adult Link for the first time. It allows you to unlock Epona, really handy for travel. Not to mention having the iconic horse companion is just cool. The first non-dungeon item you get as Adult Link, though, is the hookshot. I mentioned the long shot, but the hookshot is sort of like the grown-up boomerang with even more benefits. It can kill some enemies, stun some others, and more importantly, it can pull items to you or you to certain targets. Mostly crates, chests, and specifically hookshot targets can be latched onto. There's also 2 tunics you can obtain to switch to. This isn't a dress-up game though, that isn't until Breath of the Wild, they're just palette swaps. The Goron tunic colored red allows you to withstand very heated areas. I find it funny how 2 of the only games I know that actually have heat convection, Metroid and Zelda, are both Nintendo franchises. The Zora tunic is just bizarre. Colored blue, it actually allows you to breathe underwater. Unless it has gills integrated into it that pass oxygen through Link's skin, it doesn't make any sense. At least the Zora armor in Twilight Princess comes with a breathing apparatus. Oh well, it's magic, so I shouldn't complain. Then you've got iron boots that pair with the Zora tunic. In contrast with the hover boots, they weigh you down substantially for moving around underwater with. They also make you immune to the effects of fans, but also for obvious reasons slow you down. Don't question why Link can put them into his pockets without any problems though. There's also the Lens of Truth, probably one of the more interesting items. Within its circle of view, you can see invisible objects or see-through illusions. You can also use it to cheat in the treasure chest minigame in Hyrule Town, but hey. All around, it's used to reveal the truth and is obviously very heavily used in the worlds found in and the companion dungeon, the Shadow Temple. Then you've got the 3 different arrow types, but unlike Majora's Mask, only one is strictly mandatory. The fire arrows, of course, work like shooting an arrow through a lit torch, melting ice and setting things on fire. It can be handy for some situations, but generally is outclassed by Dense Fire since it still requires magic. The ice arrow, of course, can put things on ice. It's not one I use to spend. The light arrow is the mandatory one. It's mainly used for damaging Ganondorf in the final boss fight and the orbs in his castle. Of course, the lengthiest item to acquire is the Big Goron Sword. While you can get the Giant's Knife, a cheap knockoff that snaps in half after a few swings, you'll really want the permanent variant. It requires a pretty lengthy trade sequence, some of them involving strict timers on the items to trade with. Don't even think about using warp songs either, because it reduces the time to a second, making it impossible to finish. You really want opponent for this one. It's really the only way to make it in time, barring some seriously determined pathfinding and maybe glitch abusing. There are also masks you can obtain in a side quest. Sadly, the bunny hood doesn't make you go faster in this one. You have to sell the mask to the right people who want them in order to unlock the next one, but the Mask of Truth is really the only one that has a gameplay effect. Well, in that it allows you to talk to Gossip Stones, just like the one in Majora's Mask. Apart from that, the only change with the masks is dialogue. It isn't really a side quest I prioritize for that reason, although it's interesting that it later ties to Majora's Mask. Of course, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention empty bottles. It's funny just how valuable empty glass bottles are in the Zelda universe, but it's all about the versatility. You can use them to store potions, bugs, water, fish. The sky's the limit. You can even give yourself additional lives, and by that I mean you can capture pink fairies in them and they restore your health if they're depleted, giving you second wind. You can have up to 4 bottles, so that means you could potentially have 5 lives of sorts. Fairies only restore up to 7 hearts, so it's actually not the most healing item you can get as you obtain more hearts later on, but it's automatic so you can have it without even thinking about it. Apart from obvious key items like Zelda's letter that don't really have any use, that rounds out all the items you can acquire, and it's quite a lot of things. I didn't even get into upgrades either. You can get pieces of heart, 4 of which equal a heart container, and heart containers just straight up give you an extra heart of health. Then you've got ways of getting bigger seed and bomb bags. Quivers, there are great fairies that improve your magic capacity or half your heart damage. There's quite a lot you can do to improve the odds with. That's one nice thing about the game. You can challenge yourself to get as little as possible, or completely arm yourself with the teeth if you want to make Ganondorf your plaything more easily. It's kind of funny that you can get an upgrade to half damage, since in 3D's Master Quest you take double damage, so basically you just start taking normal amounts of damage. There's also gold Skulltulas and the tokens they drop upon death. Unlike in Majora's Mask, where they're contained to 2 locations, this quest spans pretty much all the game's map. You can tell they're nearby by their telltale shifting noise, can sometimes only be found at night, and you typically want the boomerang or hookshot to more easily grab their tokens with. It's tied to a family that's been cursed as Skulltulas, and for every 10 up to 50, and then at 100, you're rewarded by the ones that return back to normal. Enemies have a few varying types, like Skulltulas that come down as a threat from above and have to be either pierced through or attacked on their underside when they inevitably turn around. Iron Knuckles are probably the apex of non-bosses since they hit hard and are basically walking tanks, but it's not that hard to outmaneuver them. If you have the Big Goron Sword, you can pretty easily stay out of its range with stabs at the end of your reach and backflips, and it'll have a hard time hitting you. The most annoying enemy by far, though, is the Wall Master. They are hands that strike down from the ceiling, and if they grab you, you're hoisted up and out of there to the dungeon's entrance. I always try to bait them so I can kill them, it's always satisfying. The bosses vary from the initial Goma Queen that can actually be killed super easily if you know what you're doing to a dragon you have to play whack-a-mole with. The most unique, though, is probably Twin Rova. It's basically 2 old witches, one firing ice and the other fire. You have to use the mirror shield to reflect one's attack onto the other, which is harder than it sounds because you better hope you're lucky enough to have the other one positioned properly. The second phase is far more straightforward, where they've merged together and you just have to absorb 3 of the same type. She'll try to trip you up, but you just have to get out of the way if you've already absorbed 1 or 2 of a different type. You actually get a taste of the final boss's first phase with a previous boss fight, as in you play tennis with him. The only difference is you then have to fire a light arrow on the real one. For the second phase of Ganon, arrows and magic are very good to have because you can stun him for a good amount of time with a light arrow to get around him and slice up his tail with. I learned one thing the hard way though. Once you get back the Master Sword, do not switch to the Big Goron Sword. For that part of the fight, it does literally nothing and you will sit there hacking away like an idiot until he eventually kills you. Don't make the same mistake I did. But yeah, the final boss is pretty straightforward, but fittingly epic feeling, and that describes a lot of the bosses actually, spectacles. This isn't a bad thing, of course. It's Zelda, not Dark Souls, and you shouldn't expect boss fights that will be overly challenging, but they manage to deliver on just enough to keep you engaged. Overall, the gameplay is quite good and holds up reasonably well given how old the original is. It's a little easier to see the cracks in hindsight since the action-adventure genre has obviously evolved since then, even in newer Zelda games, but it's not bad. For what's essentially shaped the modern notion of action-adventure, it's still really fun to play. It also helps that the 3DS version addresses a few things that didn't age quite so well, such as having the iron boots and hover boots as items so you can switch them off and on more easily. If you go in with the expectation that it's not going to be quite as polished as later games that have since perfected the formula, it's still a very fun game to play through and mostly deserves the praise it gets. As you would always expect in a remake, the plot is going to be the least affected really. The Master Quest doesn't touch the story beats either unless you count the dungeon's layout as part of the plot. If for some reason you don't want to be spoiled by this over 22-year-old game that has a fairly simple plot, then use the timestamps to skip to presentation. If you fail to heed my warning, watch this part of the video and then later get upset like I didn't give you a fair warning. Ganondorf will be coming for you in your dreams. We all good? Okay, moving on. It all started with a lone boy among a forest of children. All of them had fairies, but he didn't have one himself. Rather than becoming a Grinch-type character, though, the Deku Tree has decreed that it is time for the boy to face his destiny. And thus, one of gaming's most infamous Hey, listen! Was given to Link. Link, now possessing a fairy, was accepted by his peers and they all lived happily ever after. Yeah, no, Link is called on by the Deku Tree. The Deku Tree explains he was cursed by a great evil and beckons Link to climb into his mouth to break it. It's a good thing he's a tree or this would be super weird. It's already weird enough when you question why a tree has such a complex dungeon inside him, but you know how sketchy details can be. After killing the Goma Queen and breaking the curse, the Deku Tree explains that it was a waste of time because he was doomed from the start. Well, maybe you stopped the monsters from spreading after finishing him off. In any case, it's explained that the man who cursed him was after Kokiri's emerald, a gem he deems fit to give to Link. Link now has to leave the forest, something that's supposed to equal death for the Kokiri. Before leaving though, Saria gives you a keepsake, a fairy ocarina. From here, Link has to meet the titular Princess Zelda, making it past her guards in the process. After an explanation of things, including that there's a man named Ganondorf who seems really sketchy, her caretaker Impa teaches you Zelda's lullaby. Link's given a letter and sent on his way to Death Mountain. There, Link meets the bro character of Ocarina of Time, Darunia. Well, at first he doesn't even want to give Link the time of day, but playing Saria's song cheers him up quite a bit. It seems that Dodongos took over Dodongo's cavern, so it was sealed with a large rock. As a result, the Gorons can't get the tasty rocks from the cavern they're so used to, and I guess their palates won't allow them to eat just any rock. In any case, Link blows up the rock and goes through the cavern, defeating King Dodongo and saves the Gorons from starving due to being very picky eaters. As a bonus, Darunia gives you the Goron's Ruby, the second gem you need, and gee, why is this story starting to sound familiar? In any case, Link heads to Zora's domain. One plot element that Ocarina of Time actually introduces to the series is the idea of the Zora being friendly. Before they were basically fish enemies, but now they're more like dolphins and are a friendly species. Anyway, Link heads to King Zora and learns that his daughter went missing. It seems Jabu Jabu, the fish deity they worship, swallowed up their Zora's sapphire, so Ruto went in to retrieve it. So Link has to take some fish up to that inflated fish, purposefully gets swallowed up by the creature and save Ruto. After smiting the Baronade, Ruto mentions the Zora's sapphire was meant to be used as a sign of marriage engagement. Well, I'm sure that plot point won't come crashing on you later. The point is all three spiritual stones are in hand. While returning to Hyrule Town, the sky suddenly goes dark and Zelda along with her caretaker is seen fleeing on horseback. Link actually had a nightmare about this at the beginning, except this time Zelda throws a blue ocarina into the moat as she leaves. That's when Link sees Ganondorf on his horse. Link tries to be defiant, but Ganondorf just fires a magic ball at him and knocks him down. Thankfully, he then leaves and Link retrieves the ocarina. Using his magic flute ocarina, he uses the three spiritual stones in order to pull out the actually it's still the Master Sword. Yep, this part of the story is lifted from Link to the Past. The difference though is that Link's put into some kind of magic coma for 7 years until he becomes old enough to be the hero. This wouldn't be a problem, but the sword decided to keep the door to the spirit realm open, allowing Ganondorf access to the Triforce. Way to go, Magic Sword! In any case, the Light Sage Rauru gives you the rundown on his medallion. Yep, now you have to save all the other sages and unite their powers too. Just like Link to the Past. I can forgive it for playing things a bit safe since it introduced the series into 3D, but I do find it funny that Twilight Princess was criticized for copying Ocarina, but this wasn't criticized for copying Link to the Past. In any case, most of the sages are quite familiar to Link. His childhood friend Saria is the Forest Sage, the Goron bro Darunia is the Fire Sage, his apparently fiancé Ruto is the Water Sage, and Zelda's caretaker Impa is the Shadow Sage. Naburu, the Spirit Sage, is the only one you haven't met before. Technically though, since the Spirit Temple has you going through it as a child and then adult, she's still technically a childhood acquaintance. Along the way, you run into a mysterious ninja-like person named Sheik. Apparently, he hails from the Sheikah tribe. Funny name, isn't it? Almost like someone made the name up, using a shortened version of their own tribe name. Although I guess you could explain it away as being a significant figure whom the tribe was named after, or at least in that family. Well, you find out after freeing the other sages that it's actually Princess Zelda, the 7th Sage. You also find out that when Ganondorf claimed the Triforce, his heart was more in line with power, so he only got that one. Wisdom went to Zelda and courage went to Link, and it also explains how Link's been able to stay alive in addition to the Master Sword. In any case, Zelda is instantly captured because of course she is, and you have to save her. Well, at least she gave you the light arrows beforehand. Braving Ganondorf's castle, Link has to go through all the parts of the castle. They're based on each temple, and you have to fire a light arrow at the orbs at each end to shut off part of the barrier protecting the main tower. Of course, at the end of each one, the sages seem to also lend their power to the cause. Facing down Ganondorf, Link plays volleyball with him until Ganondorf collapses from all the fun and the castle begins to collapse. I guess he was a load-bearing villain, but in any case, Ganondorf rises out of the rubble and takes on his more familiar hog-like form. He smacks the Master Sword out of Link's hand and must be attacked long enough to be stunned to be able to retrieve it. After that, a few more swings with the Master Sword and Ganon's down. Zelda then uses her power to restrain him. Link stabs Ganon through the freaking skull and the sages seal him up. I guess he's so immortal that even being stabbed through the brain won't kill him. I mean, it kinda worked on Wind Waker Ganondorf, but maybe things were different. Oh well, Ganondorf is sealed away for now and the day is sort of saved. Zelda decides Link should get back his lost childhood, so he's brought back to before he grabbed the sword. It ends with Zelda and Link meeting for the first time as kids. Given the memory from Majora's Mask, it can be extrapolated that she taught him the Song of Time and still gives him the Ocarina of Time before he has to leave. And that's the plot of Ocarina of Time, and that's not even counting the side areas and additional info like the Goron that was named after Link. For its time, it does a really good job of presenting an epic enough cinematic. The main part of the story may have been borrowed pretty heavily from Link to the Past, but much like Twilight Princess, it does enough on its own to differentiate things with. It also introduced many concepts that the series would make use of, such as the seemingly eternal struggle between the three bearers of the Triforce pieces and Zora actually being good. It's only a shame that Deku Scrubs just sort of disappeared in favor of the Korok. In any case, like most older tales, it's been inspired from enough that it probably didn't have the unique shine it once did, but it's still a wild ride from start to finish. Okay, this is probably the part you've all been waiting for. This is a remake of the N64 original, so how does it differ? Well, quite a lot actually. It's probably really easy to put on your nostalgia glasses and think not much has changed, but rest assured, it's a very different beast if you compare the two. The easiest thing to notice is that both Kid and Adult Link look much closer to their concept art than the N64 was able to manage. They actually look like they have smooth skin and don't consist mainly of blocks and triangles. The environments themselves are also very largely improved over their N64 originals, seen right from the beginning in Kokiri Forest. The trees alongside the cliff tops are a nice touch. It goes a long way to make everything look more lived in. All in all, the colors are also much more vibrant too, and it does so in a way that doesn't really look any more cartoony than the original. If anything, the added detailing gives it moderately more realism. The most noticeable change in terms of environments is that the pre-rendered environments like Hyrule Town are now fully modeled instead of being background images. It still has the same pre-rendered camera angles, of course, but there's still quite a lot of detail around. It's perhaps best seen in the opening, where Link's house actually allows for angles instead of just being the one pre-rendered angle. Perhaps the one thing I wish was improved, because it kinda bothers me, is most stairs in this game. For some reason, Nintendo opted to still rely on ramp stairs, and while I understand doing that for collision, it could still at least have visual steps. I don't think it requires that many polygons to do, and would have gone a long way to improving the presentation that much more. There are also some other things, like the chain in Hyrule Town's entrance being flat planes. It's a nitpick though, and doesn't really detract that much from the presentation. Sadly, another unfortunate thing about the presentation is that this version of the game is kind of censored. Now, I can understand some things like changing Ganondorf's blood when he pukes that existed even in later editions of the N64 version, but the 3DS version added a lot of new ones too. Instead of just becoming subtler or even ambiguously looking like dirt, the blood in the Shadow Temple and well were removed entirely. As a result, things look a little too clean for my liking. Dead Hand was hit especially hard. I understand if you maybe want to change the splotches on him from red to something else. What I don't get though is making him look like Slimer from the Ghostbusters. Maybe I just interpreted wrong, but he looks like a pale corpse, not a ghoul. You can have re-deads in this version, so why can't Dead Hand actually look like a zombie too? It irks me, especially since Bongo Bongo is similarly intact. Well, at least the inside of Jabu Jabu is still fittingly grotesque, given it's the innards of a giant fish. These may seem like minor grievances, but honestly I thought Dead Hand was really cool conceptually, and I didn't so much like him looking blobby. It's like he got lost trying to find Luigi's Mansion, funnily enough another game on a different system that ended up on the 3DS. Aside from that, I will say that it's sort of a shame the 3DS has a tiny native resolution of 400 by 240. Even though the 3D technically makes it 800 by 240, that's still quite a small resolution. Aside from some mildly low-res textures, a consequence of the system only having 128 megs of RAM, it holds up better than you would think upscaled to 1080p. I would even dare to say the game is best experienced like that since it allows you to appreciate all the improvements that much better. The music sounds fantastic as it always has, but it never really sounded terrible on the N64 either. After all, even the SNES was surprisingly capable in terms of music, which the N64 only expanded upon. I'll just say the soundtrack is as memorable as ever. From that little beat when you pick up the Master Sword to the title theme and to the now iconic Ganondorf's theme, everything is quite memorable. Zora's Domain is especially whimsical and charming. Romania Ranch is also quite charming to listen to in all honesty. Basically just listen to the soundtrack for yourself, it's really great. The sound effects are in the category of most games, they're fine. It is still amusing that one of Adult Link's sword cries sounds like he's shouting tick. That always entertains me when it happens to happen. In short, the presentation is mostly great and improves upon the original in some major ways. I just wish it went a little farther in addressing things like stairs and wasn't quite so afraid to represent the grislier elements. Those are nitpicks in the grand scheme of things, and I especially recommend using a legally acquired copy to emulate it in 1080p. You won't regret doing so, or at least I certainly didn't, and it really does capture the beautiful world of Ocarina of Time quite nicely. Really, as a remake, it succeeds in what it set out to do. Much like Majora's Mask 3D, presentation is beautiful all across the board. Given the recent Skyward Sword HD, especially with its relatively samey quality, it's nice to look at all the effort that went into this. I actually describe it as a remake, not a remaster. All in all, the 3DS remake of Ocarina of Time is actually much better than the one of Majora's Mask. By that, I mean they clearly weren't anywhere near as embarrassed by it. Aside from possibly altering the bloodier aspects, it's more or less completely intact. They even kept some of the non-destructive glitches in there to keep it authentic, and most of the changes like the iron boots and hover boots as items definitely improve the experience. That's what you want in a remake, everything good is kept alone and everything that wasn't so good is polished up. I'd say it succeeds on that level, and I'd easily recommend this as the definitive Ocarina of Time. It also helps that, like the GameCube release, it comes with a Master Quest, and it's even fitted with Hero Mode from the other games, as in you take double damage. That's the version I played through, and it provided a good amount of challenge, especially just getting through the admittedly confusing dungeons at times. This has been my review of Zelda Ocarina of Time 3D. If you like Zelda, there's going to be a new live stream of Skyward Sword HD right on my channel tomorrow at 4:30 p.m., and even if I took a shot at it, I still enjoy playing through it. Let's Plays are every single day, 10 a.m. and 2 p.m., and news and reviews are now Thursdays at 6 p.m. All Eastern Standard Time, but you can subscribe and tick that bell icon to be notified. A like always helps, and I'll see you next time. Capitalize on life and have a good day.